The newest one out is called The Drowning House, and it was also inspired by something I saw online. Um, no, in El Salvador some years back, there was a big storm and a house washed up on shore. Or kind of like halfway on shore. It was like half buried in the sand. There's video online of like tourists climbing around inside it and graffiti spray painted in it. And they're still not sure where it came from, but they think maybe it was part of actually an old hotel that washed out to sea during a storm. Anyway, I'm like, well, that is wild, right? So that became a stick. I waited for something else for that to stick to. And after we had sold Grave Reservations and all those, I was like, what do I want to do now? What do I want to do? I want to write a haunted house book. I want to do another haunted house book. But I had been chatting with some women who'd worked in publishing and way like before my time, and we were talking about the Gothics, the old like Silhouette and Harlequin, women with large hair running from houses, those books, and how and one of them handed me this article about one of the editors who became like the driving force in that back in the mid-century. And it was because he was talking to his mother one day, and his mother was complaining about how no one publishes books that she wants to read anymore, like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. That, well, why don't people write those anymore? That was so perfect and wonderful and so gothic. And he's like, you know what, you're right. So you're telling me there's a market for that? So he starts actively seeking out this kind of project. And one of the things that always struck me about them was the houses, because they're all these big Victorian houses, usually sometimes older, but usually big Victorian houses. And it occurred to me that the reason that's the case is because the writers of the time thought they were ugly for the same reason I think mid-century modern is kind of ugly, because my grandparents had an ugly mid-century modern with too much 70s brown paneling, and I just always thought it was kind of dirty and ugly. And that's exactly how they felt about the Victorian houses. And like here in Seattle, there's this thing called the Underground Tour, which was started by a guy named Bill Spidell. So the reason he started it was because the city was going to demo the old Pioneer Square and put up new buildings. And he was like, that's ridiculous. This whole city burned down in the 19th century. We have so little history. Let's hang on to what we have, even if you think it's ugly right now. And so he put an ad in the paper and said, come down, I'll show you your city from the underside. And something like 500 people showed up. So I passed around a hat, and the tour still runs today. But that exact same principle, just because you guys thought that these were ugly, well, I think they're great, but I understand why you felt that way. So if I'm going to write a modern Gothic, for me, I think my terrible house has to be a mid-century modern. What do I find sinister about mid-century modern? You know, that kind of thing. And it kind of grew up out of that, like, you know, a house that swims back on the beach, a mid-century modern, and this very rural island. I was looking for somewhere to set it, and I was farting around on Google Maps, just like looking around the greater Puget Sound area. And I see this one called Marrowstone. And it was named that by George Vancouver, because when he was passing through, he kicked a rock and a lot of clay in the soil. So he's like, it looks like bone marrow. So he names it the island of Marrowstone. I'm like, yes, I can work with that. And so my friend Kat Richardson, who's a local writer as well, she did the Grey Walker series, among other things. She knows the area better than I do. I was like, Kat, you want to take a field trip? So we took a field trip out to Marrowstone and took 1,000,001 pictures. And it's so rural, and there's nowhere even to stay. So we had to stay in Port Hadlock in an old alcohol plant, which sounds more exciting than it was. They were making ethanol out of sawdust off the timber mills. And so there was a big plant to produce industrial grade ethanol. And now it is a hotel. So we had to stay there and then drive onto the island. And it certainly was an education. I love my agent. She is amazing, but she has never lived in the middle of nowhere before. And at one point she was like, well, listen, I'm looking at a map and this looks like as the crow flies, this is only about 100 miles from Seattle. And I said, ma'am, a crow can at least hypothetically fly across Puget Sound. As the middle-aged ladies drive, it's about 3.5 or 4 hours away, because you've either got to wait on and take a ferry and drive, or you got to go south around the sound and go up. But I grew up in rural places. I lived in the middle of nowhere half my life, and the isolation is such an element of a good, I think, ghost story, a good gothic anyway. You can have a ghost story anywhere, but a good gothic, it needs to be contained in some fashion or another. And Colin Dickey, who's a wonderful writer, he did Ghostland a few years ago. He has a line in the book about, I'm angry I didn't write that book. It is so good. But he has a line in there about how your haunted house, it needs to be both hidden and welcoming, at least initially. Like, and like, Yes, and that's a good way to contain it. And on an island, we'll do all that. So that's where that came from, and everything that I say about it, and there is like that's true about like there was no mail; it was all general delivery out of a general store that burned down. So now everybody has a brand new mailbox. There's no police, there's no emergency, no fire. The nearest emergency services are out of Port Hadlock's Sheriff's Department, which serves the entire east half of Jefferson County. And like the nearest hospital is like 40 miles away. I mean, there's nothing. But for that one in particular, what worked for me, because I was like, okay, well, it can't just be a ghost. I mean, it can just be a ghost story, but it's made it a little more, um, eh, around the time I got started on it, there was also a lot of conversation about own voices, which I think is very good and fair and true. Like not telling other people's stories out of church, basically. Like let people write their stories. Try to handle characters who aren't like you, uh, kindly and smartly, and basically don't be a jerk. So I was like, okay, well, from that angle, what do I have in my background that I can maybe draw from? And like my mom's family is Scandinavian, they're the Svensons, anglicized it to Swenson a century or so ago, but they're the Svensons, all blonde hair, blue eyes, all of them are green. My dad's family, the priests, are Black Irish. They're like Celts out of Southwest UK with black hair and the blue eyes and everything. And I'm like, okay, well, Scandinavian weird is very hot right now, and druidy witchy stuff. Actually, Scandinavians had some really old lady witch, the shame, and like it just kind of took off from there. And there's this wonderful photographer whose name I'm completely blanking on, but he did a series. He's a Scandinavian guy who did a series of photos of older women, older Scandinavian women dressed as vulva, like these shamanic priestesses. And so I have them saved on a file. I was like, God, they're so beautiful and so cool, and they look so strong. And you can talk about your strong female characters all day, but there's more than one kind. And I just like let's come at that from another because Melissa, God bless her, not that strong. Um, but well, not every woman is, not every man is, not every person is. But I wanted to go ahead and set them up as the power to be appealed to, and then what can they do? What can they control? How can they manipulate? And conveniently, there's a large Scandinavian population out here, so it wasn't like I was even like it slotted in so nicely that I was like, this has to be the angle that this takes. So like I'm a bad Scandinavian. I love sun. Like I'm a Leo. I'm a sun child. It's just I but a lot of Scandinavians out here. So that worked out really nice. And I was very happy with it. So I'm really excited about it, honestly. So I reached out to some of my friends and I was like, would you mind if I did a caricature of you? If I used you to like inspire a character or something? Basically, I wrote fan fiction about my friends. And everybody signed off and thought it was a hoot. And I didn't honestly expect anybody to ever really want it because it is. And I wish to be very clear about this fan fiction about my friends. And but it turned out that people actually like the idea. So in real life, there was a really strange murder case in the UK in the 40s that I just ported over to an imaginary town in rural Tennessee and adjusted for those purposes. In the real case, what happened, some children were playing where they shouldn't have been playing, and they find a body in a tree. And they try and keep their mouths shut, but they're children. And eventually it comes out. So they lead the authorities out there and they find this young woman's body in the tree. And she was white. She was in her early 20s. They're not sure how she died, but they thought she'd been there maybe up to 2 years. So they there are lots of photographs of her body, what she was wearing, her stockings, her little shoes, and there wasn't a lot of flesh left. But anyway, so they're like, we don't really have the resources to take care of this. This is a little tiny town. It's the middle of the war. So they sent her remains off to the nearest big facility, probably in London or wherever. And something happened, and it was lost on the way. To date, no one knows where her body wound up. Although one academic does believe that she ended up in an educational program in the States, um, probably courtesy of like a body farm type situation for students. But even that's unclear. So nobody knows who she was. Nobody has any idea. But a little while after her body disappeared, this graffiti started turning up around town. And I love saying it because it's like this is British rural wicker man shit, like that I can definitely do in Appalachia. And so what it says is, who put Bella down to Witch Elm? And witch elm is not a tree we have in the United States, which is why I changed it to the black gum tree. But and I did Ellen instead of Bella. So mine is who put Ellen in the black gum tree. But the real one was who put Bella down the witch elm. And this kept turning up all so like, oh, was her name Bella? You would not think that that many women disappear in a given couple of years who might fit, and you'd be wrong. Um, there were several good guesses. Most of the women actually turned out to still be alive. A couple of them were turned up dead elsewhere. Nobody knows. But that graffiti continued to appear up until like the year, like nearly the year 2000 in the same handwriting. And to date, nobody knows who did it. Nobody knows if that woman's name was Bella. And someone else has taken up the cause, and now somebody else is doing it. And it's different handwriting, and they're putting who put Bella in the witch elm. I'm like, no, that's not how you say that. I know no, that's not how rural English works. But yeah, so I just ported that over to, and I put my friends in it, and then we solve spooky mysteries, and it's fun.